So you got these separate neural populations. One of them detects presence of sugars. One of them detects fats. You can kill either one of them, and it disrupts the animal's ability to make associations with that specific macronutrient. How does this stuff tie in and hook into the dopamine reward system in the brain?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we find is that as I mentioned earlier, if you give the nutrients into the gut, it'll cause dopamine release. What we went on to show is that actually, I'm not sure if this ended up making the paper or not, but anyway, what we have done in the lab is we've shown that if you remove the vagus nerve, then you lose the ability of dopamine to respond to the infusion of nutrients into the gut. So the vagus nerve is essential for this connection between the nutrients arriving in the gut and then being communicated to cause dopamine release.
I see. So that would mean, so you put food directly in the gut, but the vagus nerve is cut. You don't get any kind of dopamine response in the brain. So there's no sort of reward response to the food, which means there's no other way to elicit that response. There's no parallel path.
That's the interpretation. Yeah, that basically, if you don't have an intact vagus nerve, you don't have the ability to form the preference, the learning that is associated with the nutrients arriving via the dopamine.
And then, so when you measure reinforcement, like how do you measure reinforcement? How reinforcing is sugar versus high fat?
So the experiment that we did in this paper, so what I told you about before, where we deleted them, that's kind of a necessity experiment. What you're talking about is sufficient, like how sufficient is it, right? Mm-hmm. And so to do that, we use another kind of trick in our tool belt where we're able to selectively activate the neurons. So we either activated the sugar neurons or the fat neurons, or we also took control animals where we infused them with saline and then activated the neurons that respond to saline, right? So we activated these three different populations. And what we were asking the animal to do is basically to put its nose in a hole. So it's kind of an arbitrary behavior that it doesn't necessarily want to do, that it has no incentive to do. But every time it does it in the right nose hole, it triggers the activation of these neurons. And so if it's something that is reinforcing, that it's rewarding, then they will perform this task. And if it's has no effect, then they probably won't even nose poke because they're not interested. And so when you do it in the control animals, that's exactly what you find. We have two nose holes. We have one that causes the laser to be activated and one that doesn't, and they will equally nose poke in both, and they don't nose poke very much at that. But when we have that, so that we're targeting the neurons that sense either the sugar or the fat, the animals learn very quickly which one is the active nose hole, which one actually causes the triggering of this circuit, and they will do it a lot. So that was kind of our measure of that these neurons are actually reinforcing.
Mm-hmm. So you've got the detection of sugar, the detection of fat. Both of them can be stimulating either pathway can be reinforcing. Stimulating either pathway is going to give you, a dopamine response up in the central nervous system, the classic dopamine reward circuitry. So if we sort of step back and think about the motivation for doing this kind of work that you were talking about earlier, as humans, we live in this food environment where, we've got cheap, easy access to virtually anything that we want. When we think of a classic junk food, the things that we know we all like to eat because they taste good but are clearly bad for us, typically they're both high fat and high sugar. So in terms of the reinforcement in the behavior, in terms of the reward response in the brain, when you give an animal fat and sugar separately and fat and sugar together, what does all that stuff look like? Do these things stack on top of each other? Do they have some kind of interaction that's interesting here?
Yeah, so that's the key question, right? That's really where this was leading us to. We had essentially identified two different wiring diagrams, one for sugar, one for fat, that are separate. They run parallel to each other, but they don't cross over very much. And that happens at the level of the vagus. And I should say it also happens at the level of the brain. So if you look downstream in the brain regions that then communicate to the dopamine producing neurons, mm-hmm. along that entire circuit, those things are largely separate.
I see. So it's just completely segregated or mostly segregated pathways for each nutrient.
Yeah. And so the kind of the implication is, well, if pathway sugar and pathway fat are separate, what happens when you have a food that has both together?
Mm-hmm.
And so we did experiments. We did a number of experiments. The first one was we gave animals access to either sugar or a water solution, sugar solution, a fat solution, or a fat plus sugar solution to lick. Gave them ad libitum access for 30 minutes, and we just quantified how much they consumed of it. And what's really interesting is, although we controlled for the number of calories, so everything has the same number of calories, the animals consumed nearly twice as much of the fat plus sugar combination than they did of either of the two solutions alone.
I see. So they will consume more of fat plus sugar than they will of either fat or either sugar, even when each choice has the exact same number of calories inside of it.
That's correct. Yeah. So that was the experiment that we did. And then, of course, they were consuming orally. So there was an oral component, there was a taste component. We wanted to bypass that. So we repeated the experiment where they were licking for the exact same thing every time, but they were getting infusions into the gut of either the sugar or the fat or the fat plus sugar combination. And again, we got very similar patterns. They consumed pretty much twice as much of the fat plus sugar than they did of either macronutrient alone.
And what do you think this means? What's the implication?
Well, it means that when we have foods that have the combination of fat plus sugar, that we're more motivated to go eat it and we'll eat more. So if you extrapolate further than that, I mean, that increases our susceptibility to develop obesity, and it could explain why we have seen huge rises in obesity rates in the last 50 years as we've manipulated our food environment more and more. So I think, you look back before the 80s, 70s, obesity rates were around 15%. Now, today, right now, we're at 42% obesity rates. And that's obesity. I'm not talking about overweight. Overweight plus obesity is like 75% of the US adult population. And it's thought that by 2030, 50%, like 1 out of every 2 adults is going to be obese. I mean, these numbers are just staggering, right? And it's happened very quickly. In just 50 years, we've gone from 15% to nearly 50%. So what is it about this? What is driving this? Well, we think that the fact that we've created an environment where we have foods that increasingly are highly processed to have fats and sugars. And I think you can extrapolate beyond sugars. You could probably say carbohydrates as a whole. The combination of fats plus carbohydrates is just something that increases our motivation. And just to reinforce that, what we found, in addition to them consuming more, we found that there was significantly more dopamine being released and more neurons in this whole circuit that are activated. So, when you have foods that have the fats plus sugars, you're engaging these two separate wiring circuits for fats and sugars together simultaneously, and it's causing double the effect.
I see. So that was going to be my next question. How big is this effect when you combine the fats and the sugars compared to either one alone, but you're holding calories constant? Are you getting twice as much reinforcement, 50%?
Yeah, so it depends on how you look at it. So in terms of reinforcement, so in terms of how much they're consuming, you're getting pretty much twice as much. When you look at the number of neurons that are active, we get more than twice. So it's more than just adding sugar plus fat together. It's super additive, right? And then when you look at dopamine release, well, we just compared one macronutrient to the combination. We didn't do the three. So it's hard to know exactly if it's additive or not, but it looked to me like it would be more than just the addition of the fat or the sugar alone. So,
wow.
so it's very reinforcing.
Yeah, it's very reinforcing. And, we start to think about you could imagine why the system would evolve to strongly reinforce something like this, right? You're trying to get an animal's body is trying to make sure it gets enough calories, which in naturalistic conditions are often very scarce to survive and eventually reproduce. Do we simply just, but we don't see obese animals out in the wild. We see them in captivity. We see them in the city adjacent to when they're in our food environment that we've created. Do certain macronutrient compositions just not exist out in nature, and we've just figured out that we can create them and that we like to eat them, and that's what's going on?
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. So in nature, what we normally find is foods have a composition that is sugar or a composition that is fat. You rarely see things in nature that have a combination of both. And even when you do, like avocados, for example, it's skewed one way more than the other, right?
Yeah.
But most foods that you can think of that are natural are one or the other. And so it makes sense that we would evolve a system that will allow us to be reinforced to eat the foods that have the sugars because they exist in nature, and then the foods that are high in fat because they exist in nature and they're separate, and they're probably going to be in separate places. And so we need, when we were talking earlier about the learning about the taste and the sight and the smell of foods. Well, how do animals go about finding their foods? They use all of these different senses to navigate their environment, and they find where that food is. And then they remember, okay, well, all of these cues say this is where I'm going to find this food. So when they were looking for sugar foods, well, they had to remember where in their environment it was located. They used all these cues, and then they went back there. So it was an efficient way of being able to find the foods that you want, remembering where they were located, and going back to the same place every time. So I think from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense that we would have evolved these two separate circuits. And what's happened now is we've created this kind of Frankenstein environment where we can control everything within it, which in many ways is beneficial to us, because now we don't have to worry about where am I going to find my food. I know I can just go to the supermarket. I can go to my fridge at home, maybe even my drawer at work, like in my desk. I've got candy bars maybe. So I know where I can find food. I don't have to worry about that. And what we're left with is this one decision that we have to make of, well, what food should I eat? Right? On a day-to-day basis, humans just have this one decision to make when it comes to food. Where am I going to eat? What am I going to eat? And we've made it so that we've created this food environment, like you've said. But really, what we've done is we've created foods that are more likely to cause us to want to eat them. And it makes sense. I mean, if you think from a company's perspective,
Right.
they're making foods. They don't want to make something that's bland that you don't want to eat, that's not reinforcing, that's not good.
Yeah.
You're not going to go buy it again.
Yeah.
So
They'll be put out of business by their
enticing as
competitor.
they can.
Yeah. And so it's like no one architected this, hundreds of years ago, just through trial and error and through the competitive, market process. Companies naturally converged on things that people would buy more. And, in the absence of education, knowing like that things can be bad for you, and even in the presence of that education, very often people simply will eat the thing that they find tastiest, the most reinforcing.
I mean, and how can you blame anyone for taking something and it's not just that it's tastiest. So I think another thing to think about from this research is that it's tasty because it activates this gut reward circuit, right? So actually, if you think about it, the reason that we find something tastes good is because we've learned that it tastes good because it predicts the arrival of the calories. And in fact, as an example, kind of an extreme example, but you might really like pizza, right? Which has a lot of fats, has a lot of sugars. It's probably most people are going to like the taste of it. But if I give you a pizza and it makes you sick, then actually, if I give you that same pizza the next day, I don't think you're going to eat it. You're going to figure out that this is an aversive thing. And I don't know, it might last forever. It might last a few days. Yeah. I don't know how that happens, right?
I mean, a lot of people I think have experience with this. I can think of multiple examples in my life where someone I know eats something early in life and they never touch it again if they start puking afterwards.
So it can happen. It can be really strong. But sometimes you can kind of relearn and kind of come back to it and say, okay, well, actually, I quite like this again. But it's all about the learning process, and it's all mediated by the gut. And I think that's kind of a key thing that was kind of an interesting takeaway from this, is that the reason that we're eating isn't because it tastes good. It's because of the calories that are in the food that reinforce that taste is good.
And those two things are very correlated.
Yes, of course. Yeah, they happen together. I mean, in nature, so we were able to dissociate the two experimentally.
Right.
But yeah, in our day-to-day lives, then those two things kind of go hand in hand, of course.